It's been a weird couple of years. A really weird couple of years. It was about this time in the year 2020, when I was still living in Guangzhou, that everything seemed to change. It started with banter that year's strain of the flu was unusually virulent before it became clear that we were looking at more than just a flu. Eventually came talk of the need to avoid Wuhan. I remember traveling to Hong Kong for an interview and to visit a friend on January the 21st of that year. In the station in Hong Kong, as I arrived, there were announcements being made warning about travel to and from Wuhan. That evening I returned to the station to go back to mainland China. I got what remains, even 2 years later, my most recent entry stamp into mainland China. By the time my family traveled from Guangzhou to Huizhou, my wife's hometown, for the Chinese New Year, things had deteriorated further. My wife was making the children be very careful not to touch things in public spaces and to often sanitize their hands. Not long after we arrived at her parents' house, we discovered that we wouldn't be able to take part in a major Chinese New Year's tradition, visiting relatives. The villages and gated communities they lived in were not accepting outsiders in. So we spent time mainly with her parents and her brother's family that New Year. By this time, Wuhan had already been completely locked down. I remember the famous New Year's gala on television included a message that year of encouragement to those in Wuhan affected by the epidemic. I also received an email from the U.S. State Department asking if I was in Wuhan and needed help with a charter flight to San Francisco. The U.S. was working to evacuate people from that city. They also advised against all travel to China, but obviously a bit late in my case. Restrictions against travel from China to Hong Kong soon popped up, and the United States soon followed suit. We probably could have traveled there anyway, since everyone in my family was a U.S. citizen or else married to one, but we didn't. Mostly, I just wanted to get back home to Guangzhou. I worried about that too. Would buses back be canceled in order to try to block community spread? They weren't, but they did start requiring mask wearing, which was itself a problem due to masks being in short supply thanks to the huge increase in demand. Fortunately, my wife was able to acquire some, and we boarded a bus home at the end of the holiday with lots of other masked passengers. In what would become a common ritual for me, we were all checked with a thermometer before leaving. We returned to a Guangzhou that seemed like a ghost world, still mandatorily masked. We got on the metro from where we alighted the bus to a station near our home. The trains were running at 10-minute intervals, an unheard of level of infrequency for a major Chinese city, and yet they were nearly empty, as people were sheltering in place at home. We got to our station and called a rideshare to take us the rest of the way home on nearly empty roads. In China, the country that had taught me what the meaning of the word crowd was, there was simply no one to be found. At the gate of our community, we were checked closely but allowed to enter. We were home. I was relieved, but soon bored. It was by now February, and we settled down for what would be the dullest month I would ever experience. While we were not restricted to our homes, like most people in Hubei province were, there was simply nowhere to go. Only essential shops were open, and even those didn't exactly encourage loitering. They would always check your temperature at the door. By this time, I had already accepted my new job in Shanghai and was trying to get the paperwork done for it, but ran into trouble with the print shop not being open. I was able to get it done by messaging the owner of the shop and asking him to let me in at specific times. I'll probably never know if it was technically legal to do so, but nothing ever happened. I spent hours at home, or just walking around outside. I didn't go back to work either. School had been on break for Chinese New Year when the restrictions began, and reopening was delayed when it became clear cases were still high. Since this was at a time when few other countries had cases of the virus. Being in China seemed like really bad luck to me at the time. If I had but known at that time what things would be like in a month. Eventually things started to look better here. The number of cases started to decline, and with that the authorities started loosening the restrictions some. I remember being able to visit a park near me at the end of February, and we could even get food from the nearby McDonald's, though we couldn't eat in their dining room. I remember eventually not needing appointments to go to the print shop. School, by contrast, remained closed for a lot longer while preparations were made for a phased reopening. My colleagues and I continued to give lessons via WeChat in an attempt to help the students continue learning during their time away. It was a bit frustrating, but I remained gainfully employed, so I didn't complain. And as things in China improved, the news came of how things were getting worse in Iran, and then in Europe. And then came the stay-at-home orders in the United States, including home in California. It was very difficult for me to see Los Angeles in such a situation, far worse locked down than Guangzhou or Shanghai ever had been, and with worries about hospitals being filled to capacity. I wanted to be in my own city to help it through its crisis, but then I knew that was an absurd idea, that I didn't have anything I could do to help it, and that I was much safer in China. But it weighed on me. My prior assessment that it was bad luck to be in China seemed silly by then. The borders also closed. After initially many countries had closed their borders to China, China closed its borders to the world. This caused what remains to this day my longest continuous stay inside mainland China, with no sign of it letting up. Some of my colleagues got locked outside. Some lost their jobs due to inability to return. Others got to return under strict quarantine after going through difficult visa procedures eventually. Speaking of work, people were still staying at home in the U.S. when I finally went back to school in mid-May, 3 months later than planned. Still much faster than many other places, though. There were worries about how well it would go, and whether students would wear masks or socially distance. But things went okay despite some hiccups. I made it through May, June, and July of work, with the situation slowly moving more back to normal, though some things never really went back. Like, we never visited the library because of continued concerns about sharing books among so many people. While cases continued to peak, then subside, then peak in other countries, China kept cases consistently low, with only local outbreaks that were met with swift lockdown measures to curb transmission, followed by fairly quick reopenings. China has created a new normal that in many ways resembles the old one, just with the frequent inconvenience of showing a health code from your phone, and the much less likely, but still possible inconvenience of your entire city locking down. Inter-city travel is down from before, since leaving your city may mean you have to get a COVID test when you return before going to work, and because of the risk of being in the wrong place at the wrong time and finding your travel restricted. But intercity travel isn't dead. Even some international travel exists. I know because I can see flight paths into Pudong Airport from my home, and occasionally I recognize US or Canadian airlines, but it is very limited. Still, life mostly goes on as normal, with businesses and services operating, and with low COVID cases. Even when the Delta variant arose, things went on as usual. The Omicron variant has caused enough trouble to get us to do online schooling for a bit, but cases are still much lower than in other countries. I've been glad to be in China during this pandemic, given the high degree of safety here. The difference between what's happened here versus at home is striking. Trouble began here much earlier. While people in the US largely remember March 2020 as when time seemed to stand still, I will always remember it starting in January. Yet this standstill was mitigated much faster and more effectively here, leading to relative normalcy for ordinary people and the healthcare system alike in a matter of a few months. It's still been a trying time, and I don't see it coming to an end for a little while now, which is sad because I'd like a chance to visit home, but for now it's just not an option with the borders closed. Here's hoping more people get vaccinated and boosted. to help protect folks and slow down transmission. Well, that's my little reflection on 2 years of a pandemic. Let's hope it doesn't last another 2 years. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time. Bye.